barely a mention was made of the deportation of the Jews, which I would say is the greatest crime of all of that collaboration. There were many crimes, but that 75,500 roughly ended up being sent to the camps, and not many came back. That in itself is horrible. And until Jacques Chirac spoke in 1995 at the memorial to the Veldiv, which is the place where they were taken. And he said it was the darkest day which will forever tarnish our history.
Hello. The story of French collaboration during the Second World War is not an easy one to hear. Speaking from Britain, other than the Channel Islands, we did not have to deal with the Germans as an occupying force, much less the Vichy government, which actively cooperated with the Nazis. This is still a difficult subject in France today, and joining to discuss is Pirate Irwin, a Paris-based journalist and the author of the Inspector Lafarge novels, which deal with collaborators during and after the war. Plenty more great history to come, including the ancient Greeks, the Battle of Agincourt, and much, much more. If you can give me a positive review on Spotify or Apple, I'd be enormously grateful. But until then, I'll hand you over to me, talking Vichy and French collaborators with Pirate Irwin. Pirate Irwin, welcome onto the pod. It's great to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Great pleasure, Ollie, as ever.
It's very good of you to come on to talk about I would describe this as a bit of a thorny subject, a bit of a difficult subject, even today in 2024, a little under 80 years since the end of the Second World War, and we're talking collaboration in France during the Second World War. But is that fair to say it's a bit of a thorny issue even now, or are the French more up for talking about it now?
I think it's still a thorny subject because it was sort of kind of swept under the carpet. I would say more on the side of, yes, they had high-profile trials after the war. Pétain, its Prime Minister Laval, Bousquet and Darnot, people I can speak about later. But as barely a mention was made of the deportation of the Jews, which I would say is, well, obviously the greatest crime of all of that collaboration. There were many crimes, but that 75,500 roughly ended up being sent to the camps, and not many came back. And that in itself is harsh and was horrible. And until Jacques Chirac spoke in 1995 at the memorial to the Veldiv, which is the place where they were taken. A lot of them were taken after the initial roundup. And he said it was the darkest day which will forever tarnish our history. The compromised anyway, Francois Mitterrand, his predecessor, was still alive at the time, and he was seething about Chirac doing that. In fact, a lot of people in Chirac's party, close to him, were also furious because they said, how dare you, you're saying the state was involved. And he said, yeah, well, Pétain was recognized as the head of state at the time, albeit of a rump. And I think also it's not helped these days because Marine Le Pen, who is the head of, obviously, the far-right party, or the main far-right party, keeps on repeating that the French state had nothing whatsoever to do with the deportations or any of the worst part of collaborating. And quite honestly, that's just not, it's not held up by history. It's not true. I mean, the Veldiv, which is in July 1942, the man who orchestrated it was René Bousquet, albeit a talented, effective technocrat. And he ordered his French police to, because he was in charge of the police, to do the rounding up, and he told the Germans that they would handle it on their own. And he also gave huge figures of how many they would round up, which fell well short actually in the end, because there was on the credit side a lot of local French neighbours took people in. Some of the French police went round on the eve of or 2 days before when they got to know about it and warned people about it. There was a plus side, but it doesn't help when Marine Le Pen is, who has got quite a voice in French politics, is making these, unfounded claims that, as if, no, we don't need to take responsibility for that. And it does make it difficult to come out of that. And it is amazing after, as you say, almost 80 years. I personally don't think that people have clarified it. I don't think it's an easy topic for anyone to discuss in France still, because there's this collision between, and Macron, to be fair, is been firm about it and said, yes, they did have everything to do with it, the French state. But as you know, it's Marine Le Pen who is, well, for the European elections, admittedly, is way ahead in the polls. And so, this sort of phraseology, obviously it's not an election issue, but it doesn't help if she has a sizable amount of the electorate and they sort of take on board what she says about collaboration and the government's, or the state's collusion in horrific genocide, war crime, you know?
Indeed, indeed. So, well, that's an important thing to take into account when we have this conversation today. So, if we cast our minds back a little bit to the dark days of 1940, when the German war machine has pushed the British Expeditionary Force off the main continent, so it's Dunkirk, the miracle of Dunkirk, if more accurately, should be described as the catastrophic defeat at Dunkirk. And so, in the immediate aftermath of that defeat, what was, because some French troops and Belgian troops, I think, got out in late May 1940. What happened to the remainder of the French army? And so, and then how long did it take after Dunkirk before France became an occupied, sort of formally occupied power with an armistice and the Vichy government?
Yeah, it took only a few weeks, literally, because Paul Reynaud was still head of government, but quickly became apparent that he couldn't stay on. And they were looking around and they saw the revered so-called Lion of Verdun, Marshal Philippe Pétain, former ambassador to Spain. He'd been the war minister back in the mid 1934, although apparently he coveted the education ministry, which would have been an interesting one. But uber conservative, but they turned to him, and he pursued for the armistice, and he broadcast as such in what was it, about the 18th of June. He made his first broadcast as really leader to the French people, which of course there's barely known to the French people anyway. General Charles de Gaulle was then calling for resistance later on the 18th of June from London. But Pétain basically was saying, trust me, I can keep us as independent as possible from the Germans. But this is the best way forward, is an armistice. I mean, de Gaulle and Pétain had been close-ish. I mean, there was a difference in age and a difference, obviously huge in rank, and but they'd fallen out. And Pétain particularly didn't take to Madame de Gaulle, who he felt was only worthy talking to about making jam, which probably didn't go down very well with General de Gaulle, and they'd eventually fallen out before the war over a book, and that was basically it. I mean, so their relations were already frosty. But who are you going to trust? You're stuck in France. I'm talking about the population, the troops. Yeah, they'll lay down their arms, and a lot of them were, they were shattered. They'd had a huge army, but it had just, apart from a few efforts here and there, barely held out against, the very professional army, the Wehrmacht. I think they were only too willing to follow Pétain's orders. Obviously, the ones who were then taken into captivity didn't actually have a great war at all. I mean, it was pretty miserable for them. But some were, obviously just went home, and then mass of the French population, for the initial period anyway, believed in Pétain and the government that he created in a, how should I put it, after sort of theatrics of the armistice being signed in the same train carriage that signed the, surrender of the Great War. So, there was a sense of theatre for Hitler and Goering, etc. Pétain was then reduced to running affairs from Vichy, although initially they went to Clermont, but I think it was quite a good idea that they at least went to a spa town for an elderly octogenarian marshal, and they set up there. And from there, well, all sorts of calumnies originated, but basically it was a coup d'etat to a certain extent, because they persuaded whoever wanted to, from the Senate and from the Chamber of Deputies, Parliament, to vote extraordinary powers, effectively giving Pétain and his ministers carte blanche. And it signed off on not the much lamented Third Republic, to be honest, but it was still it was a coup d'etat, and none of the people were elected. effectively. I mean, it's up to Pétain who he chose, and he chose the devil incarnate to many people. Pierre Laval as his prime minister, although the Germans more or less told him to take Laval as the prime minister. What's bizarre that one can think about it is Laval had actually been Time magazine's Man of the Year back in the early 30s. And Pétain obviously was a hero of Verdun, Great War, and then Monsieur Bousquet had won the Légion d'honneur aged 28 because he saved a whole load of people from drowning in huge floods in his area in the southwest of France. So you've suddenly got three people who, at their apogee, were hugely in their realms respected and shown courage and everything. And then suddenly, 12 years on, some 20 years on, these people go volte-face and become absolute devils, you know. Their morals just disappeared like that. Laval had been a socialist. He was not from the right. So, and a fair few of the famous personalities from the left actually just didn't want to see a repeat of the Great War. They'd been marked by that. They were of a certain generation, and some had fought in it. And they travelled over to the peacenik side and then sacrificed all their moral values to collaborate with the Germans because that's what they saw as being beneficial for France. And they all, but I think every one of them thought Britain would fall eventually and they'd have to put up with the Germans anyway. And just one by one, these anti-Semitic laws were introduced. In a broader sense, freedom of speech was certainly not allowed.
Presumably, sorry to interrupt you there, Pirate, but presumably this is both in Vichy and because just for the benefit of listeners, France is effectively sliced in half.
Yeah, and the Germans took all the coastline on the west coast for defence purposes.
And for the sort of free speech and these increasingly anti-Semitic laws being applied, presumably that was both both Vichy and occupied France.
Well, occupied, yes, because the Nazis were in full power there. Bousquet was based in Paris because of the police, and also some lightweight called Fernand de Brinon, who was, in inverted commas, I suppose they called him the Vichy foreign secretary, but I mean, he was a pretty lightweight individual who'd benefited in the 30s from getting an exclusive interview with Hitler. But he was a man of little quality. His wife actually was Jewish, but obviously didn't suffer like the everyday Jewish person did because that was sort of, I think, you know, he covered it up by having her convert or something like that. So
you mentioned around 75,000 Jews were deported over the course of the occupation. How much did this affect the French population? Were they? I mean, you know, I'm generalizing, of course, but you know, you mentioned that some were protected and helped by the locals, but this kind of forced migration of Jews to camps. Was there any kind of resistance to it?
Well, there was some Protestant church leader who said to Laval, "What do you think you're doing?" And Laval gave off an excuse. Oh no, they're going to start up some agricultural economy in Poland. And the Protestant replied, or later said, I asked him about murder, and he replied about gardening, with a suitable disdain in his voice. And there were people who objected. Some church leaders wanted to say a bit more than they did in the end. I think threats were issued. But there wasn't, I mean, it was such an iron grip that protests were few. I mean, you know, it's a perverse thing, but for the Veldi, for instance, in July 1942, well, the French said, please, can we have it our July the 14th celebrations, I mean, you know, their symbolic day, because they didn't want to have mass sort of manifestation protests allied to the roundup. So they had it a few days later. Now, you know, at the same time, Bousquet was effectively told by Vichy, by Pétain principally, do not put children or French Jews. And he said, okay, that's fine, I won't have children. In fact, Bousquet totally went back on it and ordered children to be put on it, to be rounded up. Laval actually told him that that's fine by me because we don't know what to do with the children otherwise. And so what happened was that quite a lot of the time, the Nazis didn't know what to do with the children, so parents were deported first, and then to add to the terror for the children were then sent eventually, because the Nazis said, okay, send them on their own The end result, sadly, was the same. But I don't know. It's a bit sentimental, but at least if they'd been with their parents, there would have been a certain amount of comfort. But Laval was adamant, and Bousquet was not. Bousquet was like Laval was like his mentor, so he wasn't going to argue. And also because, as I said earlier, the numbers didn't match up to what he promised the Nazis, and so he was trying to get numbers from anywhere. So he was so ambitious and so eager to please, and that he gave free rein to the police. Now, and, there was one instance. I mean, there are several
So
instances.
just so Nazis have targets, numerical targets that the French have to meet.
Well, it was also that Bousquet promised, and I think he promised some, was it 20,000, maybe more. I think in the end there were 13, 14,000. That's still a lot of blood on one's hands. It's just that through whatever happened, whether it was just down to nice neighbours, there was one account I saw that a child survivor who's still alive, or was in a documentary a few years ago, said policeman came to the door. He must have been a detective. She said he was in plain clothes. He said, "Madam," to her mother, "listen, I'm going back downstairs. I expect you downstairs in 5, 10 minutes." And she says that her mum looked quizzical at this and thought, why is he not staying here to escort us downstairs? Because everyone else seems to be. Well, that was the case, usually. Anyway, the mother then thinks, oh, this is an opportunity. So she gathers her two children, packs whatever she can, goes down the stairs, out the door. She sees the detective, and he's looking on the other side of the street into a window of a bookstore. And clearly he could see them because of the reflection, but he just ignored them. He was giving them a chance to skedaddle, and they survived. But that's an anecdote, the sheer terror of what went on. And, a lot of the time, concierges played a role in it by, they were jealous of what their apartment owners had and looked very disappointed from time to time when the owners came back. So, what are you doing back here? And so there were denunciations as well, that's for sure. There was a balance of bitter denunciation through deluded religious beliefs or hatreds, but he didn't get his numbers. He then tried the same thing down in Marseille. They destroyed a whole area of Marseille, literally. And again, the returns for him were poor. But there's an infamous photograph of him, Bousquet, this is, down there in a fur-lined coat with a cigarette. He never, like Laval, he never seemed to have a cigarette out of his hand. Pétain was more into chasing women than that, but even at 80 odd. And Bousquet's there grinning in this photograph with a couple of German officers also grinning, and it's the most sinister sort of photograph you could imagine, as others have been rounded up around him.
Well, one area that I was keen to talk about is occupied France. There is going to have to be some level of interaction, even at a very low level, with your occupying power. Even if you're crossing the road and a German asks you or tells you to stop to allow a truck going past, you are in some very minor way adhering. Collaboration is not the right word for that, but at every level there's a kind of voluntary action. I wanted to talk a little bit about that kind of. There's a sort of a level of morality here. You're asked for a cup of coffee. You're a cafe owner.
Mm-hmm.
And you have German officers frequent your brasserie or your
Mm-hmm.
tabac, and you have to serve them. You can't tell them they can't be served.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking francs from the occupying powers.
Mm-hmm.
How was that viewed as opposed to maybe a local policeman who was a little bit more cooperative with the German authorities? I mean, both, there are many sort of very righteous, virtuous people today who would say the cafe owner is a collaborator, but that's not particularly fair, is it?
I don't think so. I think, again, well, it's business, I guess, survive somehow. And it wasn't that easy to get, to feed yourself or anything like that during the war. I think also there's a measure of whether the cafe owner would go so far as to denounce someone, because he could have all sorts in his cafe. He could have, Wehrmacht soldiers, Wehrmacht officers, Gestapo, plus, ordinary French, whether it be sort of an ordinary worker or something, and he might know that the worker has contacts within the resistance, or if he stays stum about that, then I think him taking, whether it was marks or francs off his German customers, I think fair enough. I mean, he's not resisting openly, but he's actually, instead of what he might see as getting an advantage with the occupier by denouncing someone, and he doesn't, then I think fair game for him. I think that's all right. I think those who denounce people, that's another level entirely. If you're in a village and I don't know, a German soldier is killed, and then the armored car, the armored lot come back in, and then they line up 10 people and they say to the mayor of the town, if you don't give us the names of the people who did this, then they're going to be executed. That puts another sort of moral side to it, because what are you going to do as the mayor? You're responsible to all the people in your village. So if he gave the name, I know it's unfortunate, but one can almost understand why he does, because he thinks he's saving 10 people of his village for the one that not the crime, but I mean, just shot the German. Having said that, sometimes the resistance came from way outside the village, and so he couldn't give a name anyway. I mean, there's no way. But I think those are on a different level to the letters that came in. A lot of the time, anonymous and denouncing. And Vichy had set up this very, sinister sounding Office for Jewish Affairs. And they were based in central Paris, and letter upon letter would arrive denouncing him. So that's an appalling collaboration. There's also even more cowardly in the respect that they didn't even sign their names, but they just, let rip. A lot of the time, it was just personal scores to be settled. And that happened again when the purges came at the end of the liberation too. Don't get me wrong. Lots of people who may not have been collaborators were lined up and shot because, particularly in local areas where maybe the man had one more chicken than the other, or something like that, or it descended into outright lynch mobs sometimes. But the collaboration, I think, yeah, there were different levels. There were obviously the Vichy lot, and then there were the denunciators, and then there were the ones who, yeah, absolutely openly thought, the Germans are going to win, so what are we doing? So, yes, we will also, become a member of the milice, which was a French operation set up under Vichy by a guy called Joseph Darnaud, and they had the most, sort of black berets and things like that, and uniforms, and they effectively killed a heck of a lot of their own compatriots, like resistance and that sort of thing. So those are that levels. And then, I think on a business level, you can't really turn around and say, no, I'm not going to serve you. It's not a very wise thing to do. Again, interesting though that the strongest part of the July the 20th plot nearly came off, succeeded more than anywhere, was in Paris. A lot of the plotters were in Paris and actually imprisoned all the SS and the Gestapo, which may mean that you might have had on one side, you might have had a nicer type of German in Paris at the time. Well, at least courageous enough to try and assassinate Hitler, but women, who a lot of them were prostitutes, had slept with Germans, etc., and then they get their head shaved at the end and swastikas daubed on them. And yes, as you know, Arletty, the great actress, she was in one all-time great film, Les Enfants du Paradis, which was made during the war. And one of her fellow actors actually had to flee from the set because the resistance said they were going to execute him because he was such a collaborator. Robert Le Vigan, so they had to reshoot all those scenes at the end of the liberation with him in it. And anyway, when she was put up, she said, listen, my darlings, my heart may be French, but my ass is international. Because she'd been having an affair with a Luftwaffe officer 10 years her junior. Doubt very much that she ever divulged any information on anybody. Affairs of the heart. Coco Chanel fled to Switzerland because she thought she'd suffer the same fate as her friend Arletty. So, it involved all types, literary stars, everyone. I mean,
yeah, it sounds like, French society from the bottom all the way up to the top was completely destroyed at a moral level by the occupation.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got great writers like, well, particularly Celine, who, I mean, was an absolute, superstar. I mean, my God, a rabid anti-Semite. who was very fortunate. He managed to escape to Denmark at the end of the war, because if he'd been in France, even with his reputation, he'd have been close to being executed because of his appalling behavior during the Second World War, during the occupation. And, a fellow, he wasn't on the same level, but he was well respected. Robert Brasillac was executed despite people who opposed him politically, like Albert Camus, signing a petition to de Gaulle to pardon him, commute to life sentence. And de Gaulle refused to. And then yet, you remember the famous explorer Jean-Jacques Cousteau, Captain Cousteau? Yeah. His brother succeeded this guy, Brasillac, as the editor of this magazine called Je suis partout, which was then nicknamed Je suis parti when the liberation happened. And he was even more of a collaborationist than Brasillac. And he then got tried, death sentence, but that was commuted to life imprisonment. And when he came out, his brother, who was now making his name as this explorer, implored him, please, can you desist from carrying on with your "we were right" sort of thing? And he said, absolutely not. No, I won't stop. And he said, we were right, us collaborators. It was only that there were more tanks and planes against us that we didn't succeed. So he remained absolutely unrequited. Unrequited?
Unrepentant.
Yes, unrequited love. Yes,
yes.
Unrepentant.
Unrequited love for the Nazis.
That's true. You look at the loads of pretty average people surrounded Hitler at base in Germany, but compared to France, where there were loads of accomplished politicians, Marshall, talented writers, Céline Drille, La Rochelle, etc. It swept a lot of people up. A media baron called Jean Luchaire, who ended up being executed, actually. All strata, as you were saying, of society, of some renown, got brought in, whether through conviction or through opportunism or whatever. But it was extraordinary. It wasn't a whole bunch of mediocrities. I mean, there were a whole load of them in Pétain's government, that's for sure. I mean, apart from Laval, I don't think there were that many of talent. But outside of that, God, you had at every level talent who, better or for worse, collaborated and stirred up anti-Semitic sentiment.
So after the war, then, Pirate, and this is actually, you mentioned this is where the hero of your novel, Inspector Lafarge, comes to the fore. But there is a lot of score settling, as you've just mentioned, actually, post-war from those who wanted to accuse people who were collaborating, and then innocents as well. But so was there for how long was this immediate ripples from the collaboration last? I mean, did it go? How many years did we see this go on?
Well, in terms of organized trials, as in there was Pétain's trial, as you'll discuss at some point, someone else, and Laval was Pétain was condemned to death after a long and relatively orderly trial. He seemed to only hear what he needed to hear, and Laval was executed. He crashed in Spain, fleeing, and he was handed back. The organized trials went on for a few years, and there were several executions on the, as they put it, the wild purge, the épilation sauvage. Those were where scores were settled, and there's a ballpark figure of 10,500 executions. But that would have been, I think, that would have only maybe a year and a bit. They wouldn't have stood for it much more. The thing is that de Gaulle really wanted to do this thing of, there was only a minority who were collaborators. He wanted to smooth things over very quickly and put France back in as a united country. This had the knock-on effect, as we discussed at the beginning, about, even at Laval's trial, it wasn't so much about the deportations, it was about treason against the French state. You'll love this one. You may not love it. I certainly don't. But when my hero, who has also his moral problems during the occupation, Lafarge, but his great bitter enemy is Bousquet, because I've always wanted to highlight how this man was just beyond belief. He was the last one to be tried in 1949 of the Vichy paladins, which is really weird because people would have known he was responsible for the roundup, of thousands of Jews. And in fact, a very quick side thing, France is the only national state to have actually turned over Jews in its own territory to the Nazis. which is what they did when they were still in charge of Free France. They turned over 10,000, who they'd interned in their own camps in inverted commas Free France. That was slightly to sate the Nazis' hunger for Jews, which they'd missed out on at the Veldiv roundup. It was barely asked about the Jewish deportations. And at the end of it, he wasn't executed. His successor, the creator of the milice, but Joseph Darnot, who then succeeded him as head of the French police, or Paris police at least, was executed. But Bousquet, he got what they call 5 years of national demotion, which means you don't get to vote, you can't have public office, blah, blah, blah. And it was almost immediately rescinded, according to them, because of resistance activities, which have never, ever come to light. I mean, I'd be amazed if you could find any evidence of effort on Bousquet's part to be a resistant. But anyway, this is what they justified it as. And forever after, he was protected, largely by Francois Mitterrand, who once famously said, when he was asked by a journalist, why are you friends with him? And he said, oh, there's no black and white, there's only grey. And then added, you can start out well and end your life badly. Well, yeah, that's true, but it was a bizarre thing to say. Bousquet had apparently saved his life during the war because he somehow contacted him when Mitterrand went to London and said, don't come back, because Mitterrand joined the resistance after a brief dally with Vichy. It got to such a farcical stage that in 1986, Bousquet was up. This time, they looked to have him for crimes against humanity, and after a very successful banking career. And the prosecutor sent his dossier to a court that didn't even exist anymore. And so the case was closed. And that, frankly, smacks of, I know one can be told to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, that was too much. And that was when Mitterrand was president. So I think everything was done possible to keep the man away from proper judgments. So yeah, he'd be the prime one that you'd say, how on earth did, even back in 1949, and how was he tried last? I mean, it doesn't make sense. But this was the case that they just simply, I don't think, or de Gaulle didn't particularly, to get messed up or mixed up with the fact that French policemen and French politicians had voluntarily delivered their services to the occupier to aid in genocide, the Holocaust. I can only think it was that, and that, as we started out saying, or as you did a huge disservice, really, because it carried on and on and on and on, and only until Jacques Chirac he wasn't perfect by any means, he had some faults, but he had the moral courage to get up there that day and say, look, guys, and it's a fabulous, he had great charisma anyway, which helps, but it served a purpose in that for many people on the better side said, right, he's at least tried to deal with it. But as you know, because of others, it carries on. But it did. But that took 50 years for it to be said. It's quite something. So yeah. So with Lafarge, I try to, he's obviously a fictional character, but I try to highlight, his own moral dilemmas. I mean, he's not, as I said, pure, but also bring out into the open sort of lesser known collaborationist crimes, plus Bousquet always been around in the background somewhere. Well, actually, it's just my way of really wanting to address it. Although obviously I'm Irish, I'm not French, but it's always a thing that's fascinated me, and this Bousquet thing in particular.
Well, the majority of the listeners to this podcast are from Britain and America. There's been a long-running relationship between my French listeners and I, in that we cover battles where the French have come off second best. So,
oh, I see.
The numbers decline. What I mean by mentioning that is that Britain and America were never invaded during the Second World War.
Okay.
Didn't have to deal with these kind of moral problems that France, it sounds like, didn't really want to wrestle with post-war to any great extent. And so it's difficult for us to really appreciate just how disruptive it is to society, and I think it makes it's not comfortable reading about it, learning about it, and listening to you speak about it.
I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with me, and nationalities and languages change, but human nature doesn't. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. I mean, had Britain been, the Channel Islands, we learned recently that there was
Mm,
more involvement with the German occupiers than was at first thought. And, we can't sit on a moral high ground assuming that we would behave any differently.
no, no. And there's an interesting one that my father told me about when living in Ireland, and he maybe one there, I don't know, but he was surprised of it. Is they unearthed a paper in, I suppose, Gestapo, SS, I don't know, some office in Berlin at the end of the war, where every Jewish person living in Dublin, at least, and maybe further afield, their address was listed and had been supplied by the Irish. There was some Irish minister, or so it just shows you, and they were neutral,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know.
that's rather a horrible thought to end the conversation with. Mira. For the listeners, thank you. There are links are in the show notes to get to Pirates. Brilliant series. The latest of which is The Redeemed Detective. This is a series set in during the war, but and then also after the war as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's set during the occupation, and then also score settling after the occupation, which goes for quite a while. Well, up to the late 40s anyway, including a publisher. So, not mine. But yeah, but a real life. Well, he wasn't very lively after it, but a real life unsolved, as it were, crime, which was related to collaboration. So yeah, it covers quite a few bases.
Good stuff, Pirate. Well, look, thanks so much for joining.
No, it's a pleasure, Ollie, and thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, and if you can leave a positive review on Spotify or Apple, I'd be enormously grateful. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.